Boldwood presents His Fatal Legacy, written by Heather Atkinson and read by Sarah Barron. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Alardyce House, just outside Edinburgh, Scotland, March 1897. Sir Henry Alardyce regarded his wife Amy with a worried frown. She was slumped at the dining table, staring miserably at her breakfast. Ever since her eldest son, Robert, had got married and moved out, she'd been quieter, more sedate. Her large blue eyes had lost their sparkle, and there was a little grey appearing in her glorious chestnut hair. Even her skin was paler. They'd thought it would be a relief that a monster was no longer living under their roof. However, the worry of what he was getting up to now he was no longer restrained by his parents was a constant torture for Amy. She especially feared for Jane, Robert's sweet, innocent wife. Amy blamed herself for not doing more to stop them from eloping to Gretna Green and marrying over the anvil after both families had vetoed the wedding, but Henry thought she was taking too much on her shoulders. When Robert wanted to do something, no one on God's earth could stop him. Henry covered his wife's hand with his own. The fingers on both her hands were twisted and bent after his mad brother Edward had tortured her, thick reddened skin where the nails used to be. Whenever they were out in public, she wore gloves to hide them, as the deformity repelled a lot of people. But not Henry. He loved every sweet inch of her. "Shall we go out somewhere today?" he asked her. She raised her head and smiled, eyes wide and sad. "I don't feel up to it." "Come on, Amy, this isn't like you. Where's all that fire of yours?" "I think it's gone out." "Oh no, it hasn't. It just needs stoking again." Her lips twitched. "Really? What did you have in mind?" "Well, I was thinking of catching a play or dining out. But if you have a better idea, I'm more than willing to go along with it." He smiled, leaning into her, brushing her lips with his own. Husbands and wives didn't usually kiss at the dining table, but Amy and Henry had long ago discarded convention, preferring to show their deep affection for one another rather than hide it beneath an austere front like their contemporaries. Besides, they'd been ousted by society years ago for their scandalous and very bloody family history, which had the unexpected side effect of allowing them to live life on their own terms. Their servants were used to their ways and didn't blink at this public show of affection. "There's a new programme of music and varieties at the Empire Palace Theatre," he added. "Sweet Lord, save us from varieties," she replied, wrinkling her nose. "Or we could dine out. I'm not sure I could restrain myself if people started pointing at us and whispering behind their hands. I might be tempted to throw bread rolls at them." "I knew it," he smiled. "Your fire still burns brightly." "Sorry, I have been a bit of a misery lately. You're right, I need to shake myself out of it, but not with dinners and theatres. How about we take a holiday, get away from it all for a while? We could go to the Lake District, like we discussed." As much as Amy loved living at Alardyce House, the thought of a change of scenery made her beam. "You know, I think that could be just the thing. I'm sure the children would love it. Shall I make the arrangements?" "I'll do it. I need something to occupy my time." "And I'll send word to have Riverwood aired." Riverwood was the small mansion house their family owned, half a mile from Ullswater. She kissed him. "Thank you, Henry. This is just what I need." He smiled as he watched her rise from her chair with much more energy than she'd had just a moment ago, and bustled to the door, calling for her maid, Hazel. Only when she'd gone did he turn his attention back to the newspaper and to the disturbing article he'd been reading. It was about a woman who'd been attacked in the new town, a maid heading home after finishing work that evening. She'd been dragged down an alleyway, sexually assaulted and badly beaten. It was the second attack in 2 months. The poor woman had been found crumpled on the cobbles, bleeding and sobbing. Physically, she would be fine, but her mental recovery would be much harder. When Henry had read about the first attack last month, he tried to ignore that nagging voice in his head that said Robert was responsible. He lived not far from where the attack had taken place, but Henry had managed to convince himself that anyone could have done it. The city had a dark side and could be a violent place, especially for women walking alone at night. Now the second attack had happened close to where the first had been perpetrated, and he could no longer ignore that nagging voice. What if his stepson was responsible? Confronting him would be useless. He would simply deny it. On top of that, Robert knew Henry's secret, the one he'd kept from Amy their entire marriage, and which could shatter their relationship if she ever found out. When his younger brother Edward had been executed for almost killing her and for the murder of 4 other women, Henry had used his influence to have his body turned over to him and had placed him in the family vault. He and Amy hadn't been together then, so it hadn't felt like he'd betrayed her, but he should have told her when they got engaged. However, he hadn't, and now it was too late. Robert was enjoying his hold over him far too much to tell his mother. But one day he would. It was inevitable. Henry had to tell her before that day came, in order to save his marriage. But Amy had been so down lately he hadn't had the heart. They would take their trip to the Lake District. It would raise her spirits, and hopefully, when they came home, he would be able to break it to her gently and beg for her forgiveness. He'd just finished reading the disturbing article for a second time, attempting to glean from it some clue proving Robert was responsible, when Amy returned to the room, the sparkle back in her lovely blue eyes. "I've told the children and they're very excited," she smiled. They had 3 other children, 6-year-old Lydia, 5-year-old John and 4-year-old Stephen. Robert wasn't Henry's biological son. He was the product of an affair Amy had with a footman when she'd first come to live at Alardyce 18 years ago, after the death of both her parents. Robert's real father, Matthew Kroll, had been a rapist and murderer, unbeknownst to Amy at the time, and his son was turning out to be as big a monster as he'd been. Matthew was dead, killed saving Amy from Henry's mad brother Edward, who had stabbed him in the stomach. However, he'd survived this initial wound. Amy had torn the blade from Matthew's belly so she and Robert could be free of his poisonous influence, a fact Robert had only recently discovered and which had sent him over the edge. "They could use the break as much as we could," Henry told his wife. "Things have been so tense lately." "Lydia asked if Robert and Jane were coming, but I said no," she replied. "They're newlyweds and need to spend time together. I didn't like to say they're the reason we need to get away." Henry considered showing her the article in the newspaper before rejecting the idea. After Edward had attacked her, the entire sickening story had become public knowledge and the newspapers had seized on it. Amy had vowed never to read a newspaper again after the horrible lies they'd printed about her, so there was no risk of her reading about the attacks. As they'd both been rejected by society, there was no one to tell her about them either. Let her live in blissful ignorance just a little longer. He had the feeling Robert's sickening urges would soon raise merry hell. Robert sat at his dining table like a king. How he loved finally being his own master, and he was only 17 years old. Most of his friends still relied on their parents' purse strings to survive, but Robert had his own money. His mother had given him £20,000 from her personal fortune that had not been absorbed into the Alardyce estate, something Henry had insisted on when they'd wed, because his own mother had plotted against Amy when she was a girl and thrown her into Matthew's arms to trap her and take her money from her. Henry had refused to allow his harridan of a mother to be victorious from beyond the grave, which was the only reason why Robert still had any respect left for him. Since his elopement with Jane, the close relationship he'd enjoyed with his stepfather had been destroyed. Now Robert was master of his own grand home in the very desirable Drummond Place in the elegant Edinburgh New Town, with a beautiful wife and hopefully a child on the way soon. He glanced at his wife from behind his newspaper. She sat at the opposite end of the dining table, nibbling a piece of toast. You should eat more, he told her, especially if you're going to be with child. I've never had much of an appetite in the morning, she replied, forcing her sweet smile. You don't have much of an appetite at any other meal. I never noticed before how little you eat. No wonder you're so thin. I want you to start eating more, Jane. But I eat what I need. Then eat more. Last night in bed, your elbow kept digging into my ribs. You seem to get pointier every day. Her cheeks flushed and her lips pursed. That's my natural shape, Robert. It's how I've always been. Corsets conceal so much, he sighed as though he were hard done by. Jane blinked away the hot tears. Robert had always called her beautiful, but the last couple of weeks he'd started making digs about her figure, saying he preferred women with more meat on their bones, and it hurt. It wasn't as though she purposefully ate as little as possible. They'd known each other since they were children, and he'd never been cruel to her like this before. Your comments hurt me, Robert, she said. He replied, studying the newspaper. I said, your comments hurt me, she repeated louder. Finally she had his full attention, and he lowered the newspaper, appalled to see her eyes were shiny with tears. I'm sorry, he said, dumping the newspaper on the table, getting to his feet and hastening to her side. He knelt by her chair and took her hands. I'm being very thoughtless. Yes, you are. You've started saying cruel things to me lately, Robert. Are you bored of me already? No, of course not. He looked to the footman standing sentry at the back of the room. Leave us. Sir, bowed the man before leaving, closing the door behind him. Robert looked back at Jane. How could I get bored of you? I love you. Then why do you keep saying cruel things? I don't mean to be cruel. I'm just worried about you. I heard about my friend's sister who was thin. She died during childbirth because the baby was so large. I don't want that to happen to you. I know who you're referring to. Emily Saunders. What you perhaps don't know is that she was always sickly, right from being a child. I, however, am very healthy. Yes, you're right, he said, kissing her fingers. I just couldn't bear to lose you. Joy filled Jane. She'd been thinking he was fed up of her, and all the time he was worried about her. She took his dear face between her hands and smiled. You won't lose me, I promise. He kissed her. Good. Why didn't I take you shopping? I remember you mentioning something about a sapphire necklace. But it was dreadfully expensive. Nothing but the best for my wife. Don't you have business to attend to? I do, but it can wait. You're more important. Her smile touched his heart. He was relieved something still could. If you're sure, she said, bristling with excitement. I am. We can have some lunch, too. Wonderful. I'll go and get ready, she said, kissing him before rushing out of the room and upstairs. Feeling very pleased with himself, Robert returned to his seat and picked his newspaper back up to continue reading the story of the maid who'd been attacked just a few streets from his house, heart racing with excitement. Amy was afraid something would happen to stop them from leaving for the Lake District, some emergency to do with Robert or Jane. But nothing occurred, and the family left in their carriage for the train station. The servants accompanying them followed in a second carriage piled high with luggage. They were deposited at Waverley Station, and the servants and porters hauled their luggage onto the train, while Henry, Amy and the nanny did their best to keep the children, who were thrilled by this unexpected trip, in line. Stephen, please calm down, sighed Henry when they were finally ensconced in their first-class carriage, the servants in second class. Don't hit the window, he added. You're giving me a headache. Stephen stopped slapping the glass with his palm and turned to playing with his beloved toy horse instead. Amy smiled as she watched him play, recalling when Robert had been so innocent. In her heart she knew her other sons wouldn't turn out like their older brother, because they both had Henry's goodness. It shone out of them. Robert was the one who bore the curse. Amy smiled when Henry took her hand. She rested her head on his shoulder as the train pulled away from the station. Do you think Robert and Jane will be angry when we left without telling them? She said. "To be perfectly honest, I couldn't care less," he replied. "We've earned this holiday." "Yes, we have," she smiled, enjoying watching the city whiz by. Chapter 2. Riverwood lived up to its name, situated as it was on the edge of a thick, dark forest on the banks of a river not far from the village of Pulley Bridge, at the northern end of Lake Ullswater. The house had been built from the traditional grey stone so popular in the Lake District. It was smaller than Alardyce, more of a large manor house than a grand estate, tucked away from view of the road by the trees. Henry's father had bought it as a country retreat for his family, and it had been passed on to Henry when he'd inherited everything. Amy and Henry left the children to run off their enthusiasm, which not even the long train journey had managed to dampen, in the garden, the nanny watching over them, and went inside the house. The interior of Riverwood was very cosy, with a country cottage feel. The fires had been lit by the staff from the village who had aired the house and cleaned it before their arrival. Their own servants, Amy's maid Hazel, Henry's valet Donald, the first footman Frederick, the cook Mrs. Clapperton, and the kitchen maid, set about organising tea and sandwiches for the family. Amy and Henry headed upstairs together, shutting themselves away in their bedroom. "This was a wonderful idea of yours," smiled Amy, sliding her arms around her husband's neck as he pulled her to him. "You look so much better already, and we've only just arrived," he replied. "God forgive me for saying this about my own son, but it's a relief being far away from him." "Let's not think about him or Jane while we're here. Let's just relax and enjoy ourselves." "Is that your idea of relaxing?" she smiled when he kissed her neck. "Can you think of a better way?" he murmured into her skin. "Perhaps not," she breathed. They jumped when there was a knock at the door. "My lady," called Hazel's voice, "do you require me to assist you to change?" "No, thank you," she called back. Amy smiled at her beloved husband, feeling the stress draining out of her. "I already have help." Henry laughed as they fell back onto the bed together. "I can't believe you bought me this necklace, Robert," beamed Jane, her gloved hands continually stroking the fabulous jewel around her neck as they walked the city streets. "You're worth it," he replied. "Just be careful to cover it with your coat. You don't want to get robbed." "Oh yes, quite right," she said, fastening the top button of her plum-coloured fur-lined coat to hide the jewel. "We must show Aunt Amy. She'll adore it." "If that's what you want to do, then we'll go. Let's have lunch first, though. I'm famished." "Me too. Why don't we go to Patterson's?" Robert's smile faltered. Patterson's was a new tea-room that had sprung up on Princess Street and was frequented by the most fashionable of Edinburgh society. Robert loathed the most fashionable people. They'd rejected his family because his mother had an affair with a footman and then was almost killed by her insane cousin. For a reason he'd never been able to fathom, fashionable society had declared she'd brought it on herself with her loose morals. He was also looked down on because he was the son of a servant. And not just any servant, but Matthew Kroll, confidence trickster, rapist and murderer. It was only thanks to Henry's considerable wealth and influence that his family was gradually being accepted back into society, but Robert knew he'd never be fully accepted, because he would always be the son of a footman. But he didn't want to let Jane down. "Patterson's it is," he said, forcing a smile. As they weren't far from the tea-room, they walked there. Robert was dismayed to see it was busy. There were only a couple of tables free, so they were seated at the back of the room. They ordered tea and sandwiches, Jane looking around for someone she knew while they waited for their order to arrive. Jane wasn't a stranger to Edinburgh society because of her close connection to the Alardyce family and the frequent trips she'd made to the city over the years from London, but it was the first time she'd become a part of it. Her natural sweetness and openness had endeared her to even the harshest of her family's critics, and she'd made more progress in 2 months than Robert's parents had in years in reintroducing their family back into the society that had rejected them. Robert cared nothing for the good opinion of strangers. He was like his mother and stepfather in that respect. But he knew it was important to Jane, and for any children they might have, as well as his young siblings. So he was attempting to make the effort. But always at the back of his mind was the thought that they were all looking down on him, making it difficult for him to get along with anyone. "Look, Robert," smiled Jane. "There's Tilda Warburton," she added with a wave in the direction of a small wisp of a girl in a hideous green dress that made her look ill. The woman in question smiled and waved back before returning to her conversation with the matronly woman sitting opposite her. Once again, the progress Jane had made astonished Robert. Only last year, no one had been willing to acknowledge an Alardyce in public. "Mary Walker's here too," said Jane. Robert couldn't help but admire the beautiful brunette as she strolled into the tea-room, the picture of elegance, skin like fresh cream. She was accompanied by 2 men, her husband and brother. Her husband was a quiet, serious man who rarely bothered anyone, but Robert loathed her brother, who was a preening, idiotic fop, draped in different-coloured silks and satins, his hair crimped and curled. He even wore rouge and powder. Their family was immensely wealthy, one of the richest in not just Edinburgh but the whole of Scotland. However, Benjamin Richardson was living, breathing proof that money could not buy intelligence. He was a constant embarrassment to his family, who spent a fortune cleaning up after his gaffes and paying off his gambling debts. Mary spotted Jane waving at her and walked over to their table, Robert getting to his feet out of politeness. "Jane," she smiled, "how lovely to see you." Her eyes widened when she saw the jewel around her neck. "Is that the necklace from Samuel's jewellers?" "It is," she beamed back. "Robert bought it for me." "How exceedingly generous of him. I was considering purchasing it myself, but it suits your colouring so much more. It looks like it was made for you." "Thank you," replied Jane, delighted by this compliment from one of the most fashionable beauties in the city. "That's so kind of you, but it would have looked lovely on you too." Genuine warmth filled Mary's eyes. Jane had a natural flair for making people feel good about themselves, and they always loved her for it. "It's such a shame there aren't more tables free, or we could have joined you." "Another time, perhaps," replied Jane. "Hugh and I are hosting a fancy dress ball next Friday. You must come. Everyone's going to be there." Robert wasn't sure who this mysterious everyone was. Usually it was the people the Walkers deemed worthy of gracing their home. Jane was both astonished and overjoyed. Alardyces didn't get invited into other people's homes. "We'd love to come, wouldn't we, Robert?" "We'd be delighted," he said flatly. How he loathed socialising with anyone other than his disreputable friends at Vivian's establishment. "Lovely," said Mary. "I'll send one of the footmen round with an invitation." "I adore fancy dress balls," said Jane. "I have to think about my costume." "You should wear the sapphire. It will be the talk of the evening." "I will," she smiled. Robert, who had retaken his seat, glanced up at Benjamin, who was smiling down at him with contempt in his eyes, large nostrils flaring. "And how are you, Robert?" said Benjamin, in a voice that, in Robert's opinion, was far too high-pitched for a man. "I'm excellent, thank you," he replied icily. "Especially after marrying the most beautiful woman in the world." Jane beamed at her husband, her eyes sparkling. "It must be love," smiled Benjamin. He turned to Jane. "I can't think of any other reason why such a lovely, intelligent woman as yourself would voluntarily take the name Alardyce." Robert shot to his feet and thrust his face into Benjamin's, who merely looked amused. "Take back that insult right now," he snarled. "It's not an insult," replied Benjamin with the disdainful arch of the eyebrow. "I merely said what everyone's thinking, but it's too polite to say, my own dear sister included." "That is not true," said Mary, cheeks heating, aware that everyone in the tea-room was watching them. "Don't pay any attention," she told Jane. "My brother's always saying outlandish things simply to get a reaction. Come away, Ben," she said, tugging at his arm. He refused to move, staring back at a furious Robert, a sardonic smile playing on his thin lips. Mary looked around for her husband to assist, but he was seated at a table studying the menu, oblivious to what was happening, too concerned with his stomach. "Apologise at once," growled Robert, jaw so set with fury he could barely speak. "I don't apologise to the progeny of servants," retorted Benjamin. "Ben!" exclaimed Mary, grabbing his arm with both hands and pulling him away. "Jane, Robert, I'm so sorry." Robert grabbed his other arm and held on, forcing Mary to release her brother. "I might be the son of a footman," said Robert, "but I'm the one living in his own home with his beautiful wife and a fortune of his own. You're the one still living with his mummy and daddy, who are forced to do everything for you because you're too incompetent to manage it yourself." "How dare you?" began Benjamin. Robert released his arm, and his sister dragged him to the table where her still oblivious husband sat. With one last glare at Benjamin, Robert straightened his cuffs and retook his seat, running a hand through his thick dark hair. He was surprised to see Jane was smiling. "Are you all right?" he asked her. "I thought that fool would have upset you." "He did," she replied, "until you put him in his place. Then I realised how inconsequential the silly little man is. I'm so proud of you, and to be honest, relieved." "Relieved? You looked so furious. I thought you would throw him through a window, but you turned the situation on its head, and he was the one who looked foolish." He smiled and covered her hand with his own. "We're having a nice day. I refuse to let anyone spoil it." "I quite agree," she smiled. "Oh, good. The sandwiches are here." One of the many things Robert loved about Jane was her ability to recover from things quickly. She was always able to let an insult go, unlike him, who clung onto every single one and brooded endlessly over it. The only time insults seemed to bother her was when they came from him. He glanced sideways at a smirking Benjamin Richardson. He would get him back, and Robert swore it would be painful. After finishing their tea and sandwiches, Robert and Jane left the tea room and caught a hansom cab to Alardyce House. By this time, Robert had simmered down after his altercation with that moronic peacock, enjoying how excited Jane was about showing her parents-in-law the sapphire. As they descended from the carriage, Robert assisting his wife down, the front door opened, and Rush himself shuffled out. "Good afternoon, sir, madam," said the butler, bowing from Robert to Jane. "You weren't expected." "I wasn't aware that I had to make an appointment to see my own parents," replied Robert coldly. This old fool had interfered in his affairs once too often. Rush was aware of his proclivities. He also knew that he was a killer. The only other people who knew that were his parents. Not even Jane knew, and he hated it that a mere butler had a hold over him. Not that he'd ever use it. Rush was far too proper. But Robert loathed anyone having an advantage over him. "It's not that, sir," said Rush. "I'm afraid the family's gone away." "What?" said Jane. "You can't be serious." "I'm afraid I'm perfectly serious, madam." "Where have they gone?" "Riverwood. They left this morning." "Why would they go and not tell us?" "It was a last-minute decision. Sir Henry was worried about Lady Alardyce's health." "Why, what's wrong with her?" said Robert, panicking. "Nothing specific, sir, just a depression of spirits. He hoped a change of scenery would do her some good." "Was my mother happy to go?" "Oh, yes, sir. She was very excited, as were all the children." "Why didn't they tell us?" "It was a bit sudden, sir. There wasn't time." Fury and a little panic shifted inside Robert. That morning the story had been printed in the newspapers about the attack on that stupid little maid, an attack he was responsible for. Had his parents put two and two together and decided they needed to get away from him? "This is so strange," said Jane. "Why would they leave without telling us? I don't understand." "I really couldn't say, madam," replied Rush. "Perhaps we should join them at Riverwood," said Robert, black eyes narrowing with slyness. "Lady Alardyce did say she required peace and quiet to help her recover," said Rush. She can't get any peace and quiet with John and Stephen constantly running around yelling. I think some fresh country air could be just what we need after spending a few months in the city. Don't you agree, Jane?" "I don't know, Robert," she replied. "They didn't tell us they were going. Maybe they want some privacy." "Nonsense. We're family too. But we've been invited to that fancy dress ball next week. We can be back in time for that." "I'm really not sure. I'd hate to turn up uninvited. We can go another time." Inwardly, Robert was seething. First Benjamin Richardson, and now his own family. Everyone seemed determined to slap him in the face today, and he was getting sick of it. He wanted to punish his parents for this insult. Rush could see Robert's thoughts run through his mind, and he wanted to protect his employers from him. "Please don't take it as a personal slight, sir. It was simply spur of the moment, some excitement to break the monotony. I wouldn't advise travelling down there because they don't intend to be there for long." "So it's just a weekend trip," said Jane. "I anticipate they'll be back within the next few days." "There you are, Robert. It's not worth our while travelling down there. We can see them when they get back. Why don't we go away somewhere ourselves? We were talking about visiting Butte on the west coast. We could take one of those steamers." He smoothed out his frown. "What a wonderful idea, darling. Let's go home and discuss it." Taking her arm, he led her back to the waiting cab. Rush was relieved when the carriage left the grounds. He'd thought it would be harder to get rid of them. Chapter 3. Robert threw himself into a chair at a table where his 3 closest friends were gathered in Vivian's establishment. So annoyed, he failed to respond to a cheery greeting from April, his favourite of all the girls in the brothel. "What on earth is wrong with you?" said Andrew Charteris, his closest friend. "What makes you think something's wrong?" muttered Robert. "Apart from the fact that your eyes are darker than the blackest pit of hell, your jaw is so tense you can barely speak, and your muscles look so taut they could snap your bones. You have everything you've ever wanted, your own home and fortune, and you're married to your China doll, so what could possibly be wrong? My parents went to the Lake District without telling me." His scowl deepened when his friends burst out laughing. "What is so amusing?" "Oh, have Mummy and Daddy gone away without telling you?" giggled a drunken Daniel, his dark, swarthy looks marred by the haziness of his eyes and floridity of his cheeks from an excess of wine. "Diddums! Do you want a bottle smashing over your head?" snarled Robert. Daniel went silent and held up his hands, although he was grinning. "Why so angry?" said Thomas, his blonde hair ruffled and blue eyes as hazy as his friends. "I'd be delighted if my parents left the country. They've only gone to get away from me." "Why would they do that?" said Andrew, raising his glass to his lips with an elegant white hand. He was the only one of Robert's friends who wasn't in his cups, but Andrew didn't like to lose control, and he was far more intelligent than Daniel and Thomas. The knot of muscle at the base of Robert's jaw throbbed. "I don't know." "Oh, I think you do. You just don't want to tell us." Robert glared at him before pouring himself a glass of claret and downing the contents. "And what does your China doll have to say about it?" pressed Andrew. "I do wish you wouldn't call her that," he sighed. "Her name's Jane." "I apologise. What does Jane have to say about it?" "That we should forget about it and go to Butte on a steamer." "Why don't you?" "Because I will allow no one to best me." His big hands curled into fists. "No one." Robert was the youngest of their group, but Andrew, assessing him with the detached professional eye of a trainee medical student, thought how much older he looked than his 17 years. Since getting married, he'd gained a natural air of authority, his boyishness falling away to reveal the hardened man beneath. He could easily be mistaken for a man in his early 20s, or even older, but these childish tantrums did mar the effect. "So, what are you going to do about it?" said Andrew. "I don't know yet, but I'll think of something. I'm also going to punish that idiot Benjamin Richardson. He insulted not only me, but my whole family in Patterson's. Good. He needs punishing. That fool thinks he can get away with murder. He's not going to get away with this. Jane and I have been invited to his sister's house next week for a fancy dress ball. It will be the perfect opportunity. How did you get invited to the Walker's house? Said Thomas. I've been trying for months and nothing. Because you tried to seduce Mary's youngest sister, retorted Daniel. Only her father walking in on the pair of you in the drawing-room saved her honour. Oh, I forgot about that, he said before belching. She was a beautiful piece too, with skin like the ripest fruit. I hope you don't mean blotchy, like a banana, giggled Daniel. Thomas's look was withering. You're an idiot. Our family is slowly being allowed back into society, said Robert, and that's all thanks to Jane. The three men released a collective groan. What? Frowned Robert. You don't want to get involved with all that nonsense, said Thomas. All convention and gossip and boring balls. It's much more fun here, he added, slapping the backside of one of the scantily clad women who passed their table. She flashed him a wink and a smile before continuing on her way. I agree, but Jane does, and it's good for my brothers and sister. But that doesn't mean I have to put up with clowns like Benjamin Richardson. Robbie, smiled April, plonking herself down in his lap and wrapping her arms around his neck. You haven't visited me in weeks. What's wrong? Robert smiled. He was the only man who'd ever given April sexual pleasure, which had happened the last time he'd visited her. He hadn't been with her since, because he was trying to be faithful to his wife, something he was failing at, especially with his nocturnal forays into the city, and also because he enjoyed her torment. April wanted to feel that pleasure again. He was the only one who could give it to her, and his refusal was torture for her. He'd even throttled her the last time they'd had sex, but with his charm he'd managed to persuade her it had been an accident, and she seemed to have forgotten all about the incident. He kissed her, and April groaned into his mouth. He could feel her heart pounding against his chest as his hand slid up her thigh, disappearing under her skirts. "Robbie," she breathed, eyes sliding shut. He kissed her neck, moving lower to her large creamy breasts bursting out of their corset. How he wished Jane's were like this. It was what he liked, not her flat chest. If only she was larger up top, she would be absolutely perfect. "Do you like that?" he breathed in her ear as she grew warmer and wetter around his fingers. "Yes," she rasped, cheeks flooding with colour. "Oh, Robbie." His three friends looked on in astonishment, mouths hanging open, glasses halfway to their lips. "There are rooms upstairs, you know," said a disdainful Andrew. "Shut up!" Daniel hissed at him, fascinated by this display. No one had seen April exhibit genuine pleasure before. Her acting skills weren't very good. With one last kiss, Robert tipped her back onto her feet. "On you go. I'm talking with my friends." She stamped her foot in fury. "Robbie!" "What?" he said with an innocent smile. "You can't keep doing this to me. I am not a toy." "No, but you are a prostitute. I'm sure you'll easily find someone who can pick up where I left off." "Yes, but—" "But what?" he said when she trailed off. "No one makes me feel as good as you do," she announced before racing out of the room sobbing. "That was cruel, Robert," said Andrew. He took a satisfied swig of claret. "You looked to be rather enjoying the show." "No, I wasn't. I'm not a desperate pervert like these two," he said, nodding at Daniel and Thomas. "The least you could do is finish what you started. I enjoy winding her up into a state of unbearable tension." "Sadist." Robert shrugged. "When did you suddenly become prudish? If you hadn't noticed, this is a brothel." "I have noticed, but all that goes on upstairs, not at the tables." He almost added the comment, "How common," but managed to stop himself just in time. Robert would take that as an insult about his parentage and would no doubt respond by driving his fist into his face. "I'm sure you'll recover from the shock one day," said Robert. Daniel shook himself out of his surprise. "So, what are you going to do about your parents?" he drawled, putting his feet up on the table, nearly knocking over the bottle of claret. "Show them that I'm not easily got rid of," Robert replied with a satisfied smile. "Henry will no doubt be very pleased with himself. I'm looking forward to wiping the grin off his smug face." "Andrew hasn't been able to stop enthusing about how divine your mother is," smiled Thomas. "According to him, she's the perfect specimen of womanhood. It makes me curious to meet her." Thomas had expected this comment to enrage Robert, but on the contrary, he merely smiled. "You should try. It would be amusing to watch her grind you into the dust. My mother is unlike any other woman." "So Andrew says. Apparently her figure could rival that of Venus herself." Andrew slammed down his glass. "I never said anything of the sort. You're making things up to get me into trouble." He glanced nervously at Robert, whose black eyes were fixed on him. "I didn't, Robert, honestly. I admire and respect your mother, but that's as far as it goes." Sweat broke out on his back as Robert's stare became more intense. Andrew sighed with relief when Robert drained his glass, breaking the tense moment. "Leaving already?" frowned Daniel when he got to his feet. "I promised Jane I wouldn't be out for long. Plus there's something I need to do first." He left the lounge area and walked into the hallway to find Vivian comforting April. Usually the madam was very strict with her girls, and a slap to the face was enough to snap them out of any tantrums, but she'd always felt very maternal towards April. "I'm sorry," said Robert. "Have I made my little April shower cry?" She released a hurt sniff and turned away from him. Robert handed Vivian some coins and took April's hand. "You didn't really think I'd be so cruel, did you?" April beamed at him before they rushed upstairs together. "I think I'm going to have to start paying him," Vivian commented to Costigan, the doorman, as she watched them go. Andrew, Daniel and Thomas all looked up at the ceiling when the light fitting above them started to sway and April's cries of release filled the building. "I don't know why everyone says the Alardyces are cursed," Andrew commented to his friends. "From what I've seen, they have the luck of the devil." Amy underwent a transformation at Riverwood. The gloom that had hung around her lifted, and all her vivacity returned. She charged about the garden with the children, laughing and playing and paddling with them in the river. Henry watched her from the comfort of a deck chair, smiling at how happy and carefree she looked. She hadn't been able to recover from the shock of seeing her own son murder someone right in front of her at Alardyce. He'd feared that if she'd continued on the path she'd been on, she would have fallen victim to another of her fevers, which always seemed to strike her down when she was subjected to intense emotional stress. She'd barely survived the last one, which had hit her after she'd discovered her eldest son was a violent pervert. If it hadn't been for the skills of Magda McGrath, the local healer, she would currently be in the Alardyce crypt. Henry's eyes narrowed at the thought of the crypt where the body of his younger brother rested, the brother who had nearly killed her. He resolved to tell her about that on their return to Alardyce. He had no wish to set back her recovery. "All right, boys," said Henry, getting to his feet when they produced bats and balls to play with. "Let your mother sit down. She's been running around all morning." "Aw," they whined. "Your father's right," panted Amy. "I need a rest and a cold drink. You can play with Lydia." "But she's drawing," moaned John. "Then play together. There's two of you. That's all you need for bat and ball," she told them breathlessly before sinking into the deck chair beside Henry's. "Having fun?" he smiled as Frederick poured her a cool glass of lemonade. "I sadly am, thank you," she told Frederick when he handed her the glass. Greedily she drank down the contents. "That's better," she said, reclining in her chair, smiling as she watched the boys play bat and ball for 5 seconds before Stephen accused John of cheating. "I don't have the energy I used to, though." Neither do I. It is rather depressing when you start to slow down. I've noticed it since that last fever. Sometimes I feel like an old woman. Amy, you've been running around with the children in the sun for the last hour and a half. An old woman you are not. She took his hand and beamed. Thank you. That does make me feel better. You've been sitting in the shade for the last hour and a half, like an old man. Charming, he smiled, raising her hand to his lips to kiss it. He frowned when he spied a carriage climbing the drive towards the house. Oh, who can that be? He sighed, not wanting their idyll ruined by unwelcome visitors. It's probably Mr. and Mrs. Roma from the house down the lane. They said they'd stop by. How wonderful, he sighed. We're going to be saddled with a boar with a perpetual cough and a shrieking shrew who talks of naught but hats and gowns. That's a bit unfair. They're a perfectly nice couple. You mean boring? Well, maybe a little bit. We'll tell them we're taking the children into Windermere this afternoon, so they won't stay long. Knowing that pair, they'll come with us, then we'll be forced to leave our haven. She patted his hand. Don't worry. I'll handle them. You carry on relaxing here. You're an angel, he smiled, before settling back in his chair to watch the children play. Lydia had joined in the boys' game and had managed to stop them from fighting with each other. Amy got up and exited the garden by a small gate onto the gravelled drive. She fully expected either Mr. Romer's enormous bulk to descend from the carriage or his wife's fragile, sparrow-like frame. But instead she was confronted by a pair of angry black eyes. "Robert," she breathed. His smile was wicked. "Hello, Mother." Chapter 4. What on earth are you doing here? Amy demanded of her eldest son. She could sense the rage gathered around him, which he wore proudly like a cloak. "We went to visit you at Alardyce, but Rush kindly informed us you'd come to Riverwood. He said your departure was rather hasty. We were worried, so we wanted to check you were all right." "Sorry, dear," he told Jane, who was waiting to descend from the carriage. He held out his hand to help her. "Why isn't there a footman here to assist us?" he demanded. "We only brought one footman, and he's working in the garden." "Why on earth have you got a footman gardening?" "He isn't gardening, he's serving drinks. You're young and strong. I'm sure you can get out of a carriage on your own," she said a little bad-temperedly. Jane's cheeks were flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Aunt Amy. It was very rude of us to turn up unannounced. I did say we should go to Butte on one of the steamers, but Robert's been so worried about your health. He was afraid you were having another attack of fever." Amy knew Jane really believed that, but looking into her son's eyes and seeing the smugness there, she realised he hadn't been worried at all. They'd come here without inviting him, or even mentioning it, and this was their punishment. "As you can see, I'm fine," she sighed. "Do you want us to go?" said Jane. Before she could reply, the boys and Lydia spotted their older brother and came racing over to the fence, cheering. "At least somebody's pleased to see us," smiled Robert, before striding through the gate to greet them. "I did tell him this wasn't a good idea," Jane told Amy, "but he was just so anxious." Amy patted her hand. It wasn't her fault. "That's all right. You're most welcome. We've plenty of room. We could take a cottage somewhere." "Really not necessary," she said, forcing a smile, before linking her arm through Jane's. "You must be parched after your journey. I'll arrange some refreshments. It really is unusually warm for the time of year. You can sit with us and enjoy the sun." Amy was aware she was wittering, but she was desperately attempting to hide her dismay. She should be pleased she had all her children around her, and the fact that she wasn't made her feel guilty. As she returned to the garden with Jane, she saw Henry getting to his feet, eyes full of surprise and annoyance. She was willing to wager he wished their visitors had been the Romers now. Robert stalked across the garden to greet his stepfather, thrusting out his hand to him. "What on earth are you doing here?" said Henry, shaking his hand with little enthusiasm. "Careful, father," replied Robert. "Anyone would think you didn't want us here." "But—" Henry trailed off. So many questions, he wasn't sure where to start. "Jane was itching to show you the sapphire necklace I bought her," announced Robert. "I hate to see her disappointed, so I thought we should come at once." "It could have waited, Robert," blushed Jane, looking at the ground. "We did go to Alardyce to show you," he continued, unabashed, "but Rush informed us you were here. We found it so strange that you ran off without a word that we felt something must be wrong, so we came to make sure you were all right." "As you can see, we're fine," replied Henry stonily.
"Are you staying with us, Robert?" Lydia asked him, dancing about excitedly.
"Why not?" he smiled. "It'll be fun." Lydia and the boys cheered.
"We really should find somewhere else to stay," said Jane, very sensitive to Henry's darkening mood. "Oh, no," said Lydia. "I was so sad when you left home, Robert. It will be fun living with you again."
"In that case, how could I refuse?" he smiled, hugging her. Robert's genuine affection for his siblings reassured Amy that he could still feel real emotion. After blaming her for his biological father's death, she knew some of his feelings for her had faded, as would his love for Jane when he began to tire of her. She hoped and prayed his brothers and sister could stop him from getting completely lost in the monster. She watched him play bat and ball with them, his eyes warm with happiness. Her boy had been so sweet once, but that had been eroded away ever since she and Henry had discovered his disgusting proclivities, which had replaced his goodness with arrogance and an insufferable smugness. Becoming master of his own home seemed to be exacerbating it.
"Jane, do you like my shoes?" Lydia asked her.
Lydia held Jane's opinion of fashion in very high regard.
"They're very pretty," she smiled. "Thank you,"
grinned Lydia, giving her a little twirl. "And covered in mud from running about the garden," replied Henry. "They've got to let off some steam after being cooped up in grim Alardyce house all winter," replied Robert. "Alardyce is not grim," retorted Henry. "It's a beautiful family home." "You should come and stay at our house in the city, Lydia," Robert told her. "It's so busy and exciting."
"Can I, Mamma?" Lydia asked Amy. "Can I stay with Robert and Jane?"
"Let's get this holiday out of the way first," she told her. "Now let Robert and Jane rest after their journey." Lydia and the boys returned to their games, while the adults took a seat in the garden. "Where is the footman?" frowned Robert. "I'm parched." "Taking your things up to your room," replied Amy. "Well, how long is the fool going to take? If we'd known things were so Spartan here, we would have brought one of our own servants. Naturally, we assumed you were adequately provisioned." "I'm sure you can last a few more minutes without bursting into a ball of flames," said Henry.
"Hazel will be out in a minute," said Amy. "She can arrange tea and sandwiches."
"It's too hot for tea," said Robert. "This will do nicely." He smiled, pouring himself and Jane a glass of lemonade from the jug on the table. He took a sip and grimaced. "It's warm." His eyes narrowed at Henry's mock gasp of horror.
"How long do you intend to stay?" Amy asked them.
"We don't know yet," said Robert. "There's no rush for us to leave, is there?"
"We have been invited to that fancy dress ball at Mary Walker's," said Jane. "I want to be back in time for that."
"When is it?" said Amy.
"Next Friday."
"That's short notice for a ball. Will you have your costume ready in time?"
"I have one I wore to a ball in London, so no one up here has seen it."
"Oh, good. And Robert, what will you go as?" He smiled. "Jack the Ripper."
"What a horrid thing to say," said Jane, tapping his arm.
"Jane's right," said Amy. "That's not funny." "Did you lose your sense of humour when you crossed the border into England, Mother?" "I do hope you didn't come all this way just to be rude," Henry asked him. "I came here to spend time with my beloved family." "Oh, at last," he said, when Hazel emerged from the house, carrying a tray laden down with treats. Hazel hesitated when she saw Robert, so surprised she feared she'd dropped the tray. Robert, for his part, wished she'd stop gawping at him. He hadn't been near her since he'd eloped with Jane. He'd only used her to get information about his mother because, as her personal maid, she was privy to a lot of secrets. Physically, he found her repulsive.
"Hazel, are you all right?" said Amy.
"Yes, my lady," she replied. "Sorry, I was a little dazzled coming into the bright sunshine from the house." The explanation seemed to satisfy Amy, and mercifully everyone's attention was drawn to the food and drink. Hazel trembled inside as she stood beside Robert. Part of her was relieved that her affair with her mistress's son was over. It had tortured her with guilt, because Hazel was extremely fond of Amy. However, she missed his expert caresses. Very few men had been interested in her, and her affair with that beautiful, vibrant young man had brought a lot of colour into her life. The guilt had gone, but life was so much duller now. It hurt when he didn't even look her way, his attention taken up by his radiant bride. Not that she could blame him for that. Once all the food and drink had been placed on the table, she rushed back to the house, head bowed. No one noticed. "That's better," said Robert when he downed a full glass of cool lemonade. "It shouldn't be like this in March," he added, loosening his collar. "You could always go back to Scotland where it's cooler," replied Henry, causing Robert's eyes to narrow. "So why did you flee down here then?" said Robert. "We didn't flee," said Amy. "We wanted a break, that's all. There's nothing sinister about it." "You could have sent us..."